Hello, everyone. Welcome to the ninth lecture of the International Society for Folk Narrative Research Lecture Series entitled Voices from Around the Globe. My name is Miriam, and I'm a member of the Executive Committee of the ISFNR. As you already know, on the third Friday of the month, every 2 months, not counting summer and winter holidays, the Executive Committee of the ISFNR is organizing a lecture and thus providing everyone the opportunity to listen to folklorists coming from different parts of the world, from South America, Europe, North America, Asia to Africa. In each case, the pre-recorded online lecture is followed by a live Zoom meeting in which those attending are able to ask the lecturer questions or make comments. All lectures without discussions will then be available on the ISFNR website, meaning that anyone who wishes to make use of them as part of their research or in their teaching will be able to do so. Today, we will be presenting a lecture entitled Narrative and the Promise of Empathy. The lecture will be given by Dr. Amy Shuman, Professor Emerita from the Ohio State University, USA. She will be introduced by Professor Terry Gunnell from the University of Iceland, from Iceland. Before we start, let me just briefly express a special thanks to today's lecturer for giving the talk, to Terry for introducing the lecturer and chairing this discussion, to Sadna for having initiated the series, to Nidhi for circulating the invitations, and finally to Silvia for the technical support. Let me also announce in advance that on Friday, the 16th of February 2024, our next lecturer will be Professor Mayako Murai from Japan with the lecture Multi-Species Fairytale Library Project, Designing a Public Library Exhibition in Rural Japan. Right, so without any further ado, let us now proceed with the first with the lecture. First with the introduction of Professor Shuman and then with the lecture itself. So please don't forget to stay online when the lecture finishes. As I mentioned earlier, you will then have the opportunity to ask questions, to make comments, or simply to have a chat with your colleagues. So Terry, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Nice to see you all here. As Miriam said just now, my name's Terry Gunnell. I'm a Professor Emeritus at the University of Iceland, and I'm on the Executive Committee of the ISFNR. And it's my great pleasure, I'm very honored to be introducing here Professor Emeritus, right? Emerita. Yes, I've got to get the endings right here. Amy Shuman, who is in the Department of English, Ohio State University, where she worked from 1981, some time back. To give a complete introduction to Amy's CV, we'd need to have 2 programs, I think, for this in general. Just looking over what we have, just to mention the most recent full publications, we've got Storytelling Rights, the Use of Oral and Written Text by Urban Adolescents, which was published by Cambridge University Press, 1986 initially, and then republished in 2006 as a paperback. We've got Rejecting Refugees, Political Asylum in the 21st Century, with Carol Bomer, who you've worked with quite a lot before, I think, on articles. And that was published by Routledge, 2007. And then Political Asylum Deceptions, The Culture of Suspicion, again with Carol, published by Palgrave in 2017. Just looking at the number of articles written by Carol, written by Amy and Carol and many other people, there's at least 70 articles here, which is quite amazing. And it's quite understandable that Amy is then given a Lifetime Achievement Award by the American Folklore Society in 2019. So Amy's going to be presenting, as we heard just now, let's get the right paper here. The lecture's entitled Narrative and the Promise of Empathy, and it's recorded. And as Amy says, there are a couple of places where she is introducing speakers, and there'll be maybe some slight pauses as it gets going in the recording. So don't give up and go away for a coffee or anything there. Just stay around, and then the speakers will start. Okay, so if we can start playing the recording, and then we'll see you all at the end of the recording.
Hello, everyone, and thanks for being here. My talk today is about narrative and the promise of empathy. I realize that we're speaking about this at a time of increased tensions around the world. The promise of empathy, the idea of understanding others across differences in time, space, and experience. and crossing differences, even when we don't share histories, cultures, or points of view, seems even more important. But the promise of empathy can be shallow and one-sided, ignoring those very differences and doing nothing to change the position of those who suffer. Narrative is one of the ways that empathy can occur or even be expected, so it's a good place to look at those challenges. So today I'll discuss some of the tools that we have developed as folklorists studying narrative to better understand both the limits of empathy and the limits of narrative. In this talk, I focus on personal stories, though of course empathy is also offered in literary, journalistic, and other media forms of narrative. Actually, narrative is not even necessary for empathy. The #MeToo movement is a striking example in which a slogan rather than a narrative has not only offered empathy, but has fostered a social political movement that has created significant social change. The #MeToo movement allowed people to speak up without actually telling their stories. All they had to do was post #MeToo. Of course, many did tell their stories, and many talked about not being able to tell them. #MeToo was part of a larger problem of telling the untellable. Tellability refers to both the told and the untold, the concealed and the revealed, half-told secrets, memories that died with a particular person, memories that were passed on, fragments that are not intelligible, and pieces that are put together as best one can. It's the effort to remember and to forget the things that could be told but haven't been told. All of these point to relationships among not only tellers and listeners, but also the people described in a story, the would-be listeners, and those who might understand, as well as those who aren't really listening. Today, I will describe my Aunt Rosalind's experiences of telling and not telling her struggles to survive the Holocaust. Her accounts raise questions not only about tellability, but also about what she knew, when, what she knew at the time, and what she discovered much later. In her narratives, she talks about the things she can't remember, the things she never knew, and now has no one to ask about, and the opposite, unbidden memories that can flood her, prompted by the small events of everyday life. Two of the components for understanding trauma narrative and empathy are, one, tellability, and two, recognizing and managing gaps in our knowledge about situations. I want to add a third component today, the multiple voices engaged by a narrator as part of an interactive approach to understanding narrative and empathy. And I want to suggest that where the first two, tellability and the gaps in knowledge, can serve as impediments to empathy, the third, the multiple voices, can provide a way to listen across difference. In this work, I'm building on decades of folklorists' narrative research, including many studies of the conditions in which people tell and don't tell their stories, as well as gaps in knowledge. For example, fairy tales are rife with secrets, with prohibitions against telling, warnings about who to tell and not to tell, and characters using disguise to get information. In addition to information withheld from a character and the misleading information provided by tricksters, there are gaps in information, including my favorite, the reunification of separated characters whose connection to each other is only revealed at a final crucial moment. Much is known about hidden and disclosed knowledge, from Irving Goffman's work on collusion to studies of narrative riddles in the work of Galhida Zanrokem and Sabra Weber. And questions about telling and not telling also include who has the right to tell whose stories, to whom and when and in what contexts. This is a foundational dimension of the interactive approach to narrative. Interactive understandings of story ownership and story tellability can be traced to the work of Harvey Sachs and Irving Goffman, both of whom in different ways called attention to how narrating is about social relationships. The performance framework, Gumpers and Himes, for example, also contributes to our understanding of who tells what to whom, under what circumstances, including the decision not to tell. Questions in an interactive approach include, are claims to tell based on one's proximity to the events recounted? What kind of identity claims do people make, both about themselves and about others, for example, as perpetrators, victims, or bystanders? Who has the authority and who claims to have more accurate, more privileged, more insider, or more expert knowledge? How do participants align themselves to each other? And what responsibilities, if any, do they bear toward each other and toward the events they describe? How do tellers and listeners position themselves and their stories in contexts from the local and face-to-face to the very remote interactions that, for example, include social media? Interactional approaches consider the many relationships and obligations tellers and listeners have to each other, and thus always include expectations that are related to particular forms, particular genres, in particular contexts and cultures. The many considerations of when people don't tell or don't want their stories told, for example, include the question of believing that one has a story worth telling, or having a way to talk about very difficult or traumatic topics. There's also the issue of whether narrators believe that they'll be heard, or whether there might be other consequences to telling. The stories I want to talk about today, my aunt's stories, help us to understand the reluctance and obligation to tell a story, to send it out into the world, to serve as a testimony, and thus perhaps to serve as a reminder that something happened, that it should not be forgotten, to serve as a warning, a caution that it could happen again, to serve to heal, to remedy, to create social change, or to attempt to confirm particular versions of history and maybe deny others. In her essay, Reciprocal Ethnography, Elaine Lawless asks us to listen for silenced voices, for the voices of those who suffer the terrible consequences from speaking, or to the difficulty of finding one's own story in a climate of dominant, oppressive stories, and also to the problem of being heard. Along with not telling, it's important to consider how particular voices are silenced in narrating atrocity. The feminist life story scholar Lee Gilmore describes what she calls testimonial erasure in her chronicle of the Brett Kavanaugh and Christine Blasey Ford testimonies in the United States. As Lawless and others have observed, sometimes women whose voices may have been suppressed in public domains of everyday life and in politics have other genres available to them. Joe Radnor and Susan Lanzer's examination of Susan Glaspell's short story, A Jury of Her Peers, a discussion that appears in the book Feminist Messages, provides one of the most vivid examples of what they describe as implicit coding, in which, in this case, the protagonist spoke through her knitting. And importantly, her audience of neighborhood women knew to read her knitting as evidence of abuse. It's a really excellent example of the importance of being able to decode and to listen. Folklorists have also contributed to the relationship between important history chronicling stories of momentous events that need to be documented and should not be forgotten, and as well as to the very local particular stories, an event that is perhaps only meaningful to the participants themselves. Many of the folklorists who work on narrative and trauma don't make a distinction between the momentous and the locally relevant. In fact, I'd go so far as to say that this blurring of the momentous and the locally relevant is a quintessential dimension of a folkloristic approach to narrative. And now I'm going to turn to my example. My Aunt Rosalene is my aunt by marriage. I met her when I was 11, when she married my uncle. At that time, we didn't talk about her war experiences, and I heard only vague reference to the fact that her mother had been killed in a concentration camp. I only learned Rosalene's story 50 years later, when a member of my family found her Shoah Foundation interview on YouTube. Between 1994 and 1999, the Shoah Foundation interviewed 52,000 survivors of the Holocaust. And they continue to collect testimonies from survivors of other genocides. By the time Rosalind told her story, she was living in the United States and had joined a group of adults living in Washington, D.C., who as children had been in hiding during the Holocaust. Someone in the group persuaded her to tell her story. Since then, she's become a frequent teller at the U.S. Holocaust Museum, and she and I have had many conversations about telling and not telling her story, especially reviewing what it was like for her during the decades that she felt no one wanted to hear her story. When I first met her, I was told not to ask too many questions, and especially not to ask about her family. I knew that her grandmother was still alive because Rosalind and my uncle went to visit her a couple of times a year in Paris. And I also knew about her cousin, also alive, but I didn't know that not only her mother, but also everyone else in her family had been murdered in the camps. And I didn't know what Rosalind herself had done during the war. In recent years, I learned that Rosalind didn't feel she had a story to tell because she wasn't properly a Holocaust survivor, because she hadn't been deported and hadn't been in a concentration camp. Beyond not having the right kind of story to tell, she said she felt a strong prohibition against describing her experiences at all. Her family migrated from Poland to Paris after World War I. Her mother was deported along with many other immigrant Jews in Paris in 1942. She describes that in July 16 and 17 of 1942, there was a roundup of the foreign Jews in Paris, whether they were children or adults or elderly people. Everyone was taken. The French Jews themselves were not taken until later. Rosalind's mother had been warned by a policeman that she should leave because there was going to be this big roundup. So she left her apartment. Rosalind stayed with her grandmother, and they came for her and she wasn't there, which meant she couldn't go back. So she needed to find a way to get to the free zone in France, and she got false papers made. So Rosalind doesn't know how she managed to do that, but they somehow managed to do that. But the problem is the person who helped them get the false papers betrayed them, and they were arrested. And they were sent to Drancy, which was kind of a holding zone for the Jews outside of Paris. And then she was deported to Auschwitz. But Rosalind only learned about this much, much later. She only learned much later that she wouldn't come back. She learned that they asked for volunteers from Drancy to accompany children in the wagons that were going to Auschwitz. And Rosalind's mother volunteered. She found out about this because there was a woman in her building who had been deported to Drancy, but who was very, very ill and who was sent back to the neighborhood. And she knew that Rosalind went and volunteered. But she only found out much later that, as she says, that anyone who was a volunteer with the children, when they didn't die on arrival after several days in a closed train car, without water, without food, was gassed on arrival. And as Rosalind says, so she had no chance. This is really just the bare facts of Rosalind's mother's deportation. She only inserts herself into the narrative to remind her listener over and over that she learned a lot of this much later. What she didn't know at the time was that her mother would not come back and that she had no chance. In 1998, a long time after the Holocaust, she was able to find documents in the Jewish archives in Paris that list her mother's deportation and the list of individuals on the convoy, including the birth dates of all of the children in that car, some as young as 2 years old. Meanwhile, she and her grandmother made decisions and plans as if her mother would return. Now I'm going to play a little bit of her narrative. Not working. Sorry. We are.
The reason we learned about this is that Mrs. Greenspan, who was the mother of the friends of ours who were in Louvciennes, had been arrested with one of the daughters. The three others escaped with her father. But she, I think, stayed behind, didn't believe she would be arrested because she had terminal tuberculosis and she felt that maybe she would be safe. Well, she wasn't safe. She was arrested with one of her daughters. And she was eventually released, and I don't know how this happened. She was sent back home, and this must have been in September or October 42. And she told us that she saw my mother, and she's the one who knew that she had volunteered for a children's convoy with another woman. Every wagon had to have at least 2 adults. And what I did not know then, I felt that maybe, well, she would be saved this way. What I learned much later, years later, is that women who had volunteered to be with convoys of children were, if they were not dead on arrival, were gassed on arrival. So there was not very much of a chance that my mother would ever come back. But I learned this much later.
We have to change tapes and we'll pick up right there.
So this is what I describe as Rosalinde's untellable story, her unrecovered chronotope, the gap that persists as trauma for Rosalinde today. In contrast, Rosalinde tells many narratives about her own experiences, none of which parallel the terror she imagines but cannot describe that her mother must have experienced, and all of which are told in the shadow of the story of losing her mother. So in the interview, the interviewer keeps prompting her to talk about how she learned this story. She tells the story as an adult, but the 12-year-old narrator appears significantly, creating what I'm calling a multi-voiced, multi-temporal narrative that takes account of her interaction with others in the process of telling, not telling, and retelling her story, both about the things that happened and the things that could have happened. She integrates the prior interaction and her present narration into her story, and she also sees herself as part of the larger enterprise of documenting what happened during the Holocaust. She pieced together the story about her mother's deportation from bits of information that she heard from others at different points a lot later. When Rosalinde's mother was deported, Rosalinde and her grandmother hid out in the mother's apartment in Paris. They figured that the Nazis wouldn't come looking if they had already taken the resident. Then, when they felt that space was too dangerous, they got false papers and made their way to Voiron, a town near the Swiss border, where they pretended to be Christians fleeing Paris, a common enough possibility, But those events took place before we had the category Holocaust. And I'm telling them as if they already had that chronology. Actually, it was a day-to-day experience of survival for Rosalind. And if she had a bigger picture at the time, it was her assumption that eventually she would be reunited with her mother. Life in Voiron was only temporary. And now I'm going to play another clip of them leaving Paris to go to Voiron. Apologize for the break.
Go down and stop in front of a certain building, and we would say to each other, this is where the Goldbergs are hiding. And sure enough, the Goldbergs were taken out. You could see them climb in the truck, and they were taken. So there was this total fear that they might come and not believe the concierge, that there was no one in the apartment, and try to get up and get us too. Sometimes we heard all these rumors, so we would go and spend the night in the attic. There was an attic in this building, so we'd be there, the attic, with mice. And sometimes we would try to hide that way for the night.
And you went on doing that for more than a year.
Yes.
In a year later, after your mother had been arrested and deported, in August of 1943, your grandmother decided you needed to go to Vichy.
My aunt and my cousin
Bernard,
that is the wife of my sister-in-law of my mother, and a little nephew, the husband was already deported, which is ironic because he had enlisted in the army. And he was in the army, it would have been terrific for him to stay, but he got very sick, so they sent him home. And had he stayed in the army, he would have been made prisoner and he would have survived. But they sent him home, so he was arrested at 41, actually, and deported in June of 42. So my aunt and my cousin had already left. I don't remember when they left, because we really couldn't communicate very much, no telephones. The only way to communicate was to go to the place where the person lived.
and do that at great risk by going
So they
out.
left, and again, we couldn't write letters, which would have been more personal. You could only write postcards, and because the postcard could be read. So it was very difficult to explain, to tell, how can we join you? So my aunt would write, maybe it's time for a vacation or something like that. So anyway, we decided it had become really, really too difficult to stay in Paris because every day something terrible happened. So we found someone, to some friends who was in the resistance, who made us false papers. That is, false papers for my grandmother and a birth certificate for me since I was so young. There was a big problem with that too, is my grandmother was Polish. Her French was not so wonderful, and all we spoke home together was Yiddish. So here she had an ID card which was French. She had to learn where she was born, near Lyon somewhere. She had another name, and she was supposed to be French and speak French. So it was a really serious problem.
So anyway, we managed to get the papers. We managed to get to the trains and to arrange with my aunt to be there. And, but getting in the train and crossing was one of my greatest fear, I think. It's really awful because we had to go through two
checkpoints, two different checkpoints.
Two different checkpoints. You had the German, when we left Paris, the German checkpoint, and then to the French checkpoint when we got to the free zone. And they would come, and this was an overnight train. So I made arrangements with my grandmother. I think I decided at 12-year-old, I was in charge. I told her that it would be better if she slept. She made believe she slept, and I would take care of the papers. And that's what happened. So the German police came, and I was pretty shaken. I was really afraid. And I explained to the German policeman that this was my grandmother and she was asleep, and please don't wake her up. How did I have to do that? I don't know. But it worked. And then the next checkpoint was French one. Same thing happened. It was, I had to explain this again, although I was so terrified. But it worked, I guess. A little girl, an old woman sleeping. Okay, it worked. So we managed to get through, which was wonderful. But I think I was shaking so much after that. I was so terrified.
Rosalind, when I met you and you told me about this, it became very clear that you had been through many, many very frightening experiences. But you said about that crossing, I was so shaken. I don't believe I've ever been more scared in my entire life than that particular time as a 12-year-old girl.
I think it's about right. I don't think I was ever more scared.
The burden was entirely on you, but you made it. So now you're in Vichy, France. Where did you go from there?
We went to join my aunt, who was living in a place called Saint-Jean-de-Mont.
Rosalind positions herself as a child in the narrative, with commentary about her adult self, and she does this several times, especially when describing the fear, I was so scared. We see her actually using reported speech in the present moment, saying, speaking to the policeman, please don't wake up my grandmother. She doesn't do this in her narrative about her mother's deportation because there is no moment for her 11-year-old self to describe, only the adult commentary, and I knew much later that she would not come back. The story about the train checkpoints, like many other incidents she describes, is not only about what happened, but what could have happened. They could have been found out on the train, and then they would have been deported. Like many survivors, she lives not only with what did happen, but what could have happened, and that's a story she knows well. She tells that as part of a warning to her listeners. It could happen again. The train checkpoint story is, in Bakhtin's terms, a chronotope, marking space and time. Additionally, it marks life and death, not a before and after, but a moment when things could go either way. The policeman, the Nazi policeman and the French policeman, they had absolute power over her destiny. She refers only briefly to what could have happened and says, we would have been found out. In some versions, she says that would have been the end. Gerald Prince refers to the narration of things that did not take place but could have as disnarration, elaborating on the question of what gets told and when it gets told. Susan Lanzer and Shlomit Keenan describe what they call displaced narration. Their discussion focuses on details that aren't mentioned until later, or a big reveal that occurs strategically in a text. Rosalind's telling of the train checkpoint story is not strategic, but instead she places it in the chronology of her departure from Paris and the subsequent months of hiding in Voiron. The chronological displacement is emotional as well as temporal. Some stories attempt to make sense out of the senseless, to recount not only what did happen, but what should not have happened. On the one hand, what I've called the availability of narrative is a matter of finding some way to take account of the unaccountable. And on the other, claiming a narrative is a way of understanding events with and enjoins particular obligations on tellers and listeners. So I'm describing empathy as one of those kinds of obligation, sometimes creating a possibility for understanding across difference, sometimes unfortunately involving sentimentality, sometimes romanticizing tragedy as someone else's inspiration, but in any case, deeply compromising the relationship between tellers and listeners. Empathy requires either reframing experience to find common ground or accepting the possibility that some experiences cannot be shared. It relies on, but also destabilizes the association between people and their experiences. It destabilizes story ownership by creating the possibility that people can tell each other's stories, something that incidentally Rosalind would like to see. It also can make a personal story allegorical, representative, typical, or stereotypical of a situation. I've talked about this some in my work with the example of the poster child in disability narratives. The poster child is a story that belongs to an individual, but it's allegorized for public use. Storytelling offers as one of its greatest promises the possibility of empathy, understanding across time and space. But if it inspires inspiration rather than understanding, it is often used by those in more privileged positions of empathizer rather than the person who is empathized. In my past work, I've proposed that we consider critical empathy, that is, that we recognize that empathic understanding is a precarious enterprise, not to be assumed or taken lightly. The primary obstacle is, of course, that we can't always find the meaning we seek. Some experiences defy explanation or understanding. Sometimes we lack crucial information. Sometimes we have multiple conflicting or changing perspectives. Or sometimes it's just because we're trying to tell a story we really believe should not have happened. All of these produce narrative insufficiencies, a dimension of narrative at its limits. And in essence, when we're sharing these stories with others, we're sharing not only what happened, but what could have happened, what might have happened, and what should not have happened. Irene Kacandes uses the term co-witness to describe her role in attempting to fill in the account of her father's Holocaust experiences. Late in her father's life, when his memory was fading, she attempted to piece together some of the missing pieces, not to create an historical record, but as she says, to address some of the questions that continued to plague him. Rosalind is not seeking empathy when she tells her story. Every week, she serves as a volunteer at the U.S. Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., where she tells her story and meets with visitors. The interviewer for the segment I played is a very gifted interlocutor, and she often praises him for the ways he draws her out. He serves as what Holocaust scholar Dory Laub has called a true witness. In contrast, the visitors to the museum ask questions that are less helpful to her, and she nonetheless engages with every visitor and every question, and this is an important part of her mission. So for me, for trying to understand interactive narrative, I asked her to tell me some of those questions. And because her hearing is hard, she's been asking people to write them down, and she's kept a small collection. Here are a few. What was it like losing all your family at such a young age? How many years were you in hiding? What has your life experience done to your faith? Do you experience people who are willing to help you and your family? Do you think the US military is trained and prepared to prevent another genocide? What do you think needs to be learned? After your experience, did you find happiness? How did you get your false identification papers? How did you know who to trust? And then I'll give you a couple where I'll tell you her answers. One said, knowing what you know now, what would you tell your 11-year-old self about life? And that one she answered by saying, I just wanted to live and do whatever was necessary to live. Another one was, what is the most important thing we should take from our visit today? And that is really an important question to her. She answered, to be informed. She explains that many of the children who visit the Holocaust Museum have never heard of the Holocaust before, and she tells them to read. She tells all of her visitors, adults and children, if they see anything wrong, they have to speak. If no one speaks up, there will be no one when someone comes for them. She says they can't be ignorant, they can't be indifferent. They may think they are not concerned now, but they may be next. What Rosalind seeks, her reason for telling her story week after week, as difficult as that is for her, both emotionally and as a 92-year-old, you saw her in a clip 20 years ago and more recently, is to counter indifference. That is perhaps one part of empathy, and it's perhaps made more possible by her telling her story. I want to conclude by proposing one of the ways that empathy does work. As I said, in my work, I've often pointed to problems of tellability and gaps in knowledge that can serve as obstacles, both to telling a story at all and to understanding across difference. Both those obstacles, however, when I've looked at my aunt's interactions, are really second to the multi-voicedness that produces multiple entry points and ways for listeners to enter her story. We hear from Rosalind, the 11 and then 12-year-old. We hear her saying it as an adult, and I didn't include this part, but she says there should have been an adult taking care of her. I haven't had time to play more segments, but many of them do include the voices of people who helped her, including a Christian family, the Martins, who owned a laundry in her Paris neighborhood and allowed Rosalind and her grandmother to sleep in the laundry when they couldn't sleep in the attic. And she recounts the stories of another family that gave her a bit of money and welcomed her into their home. And there are others about, in a story about her, in the story that I did play about her mother's deportation, we hear about the friendly policeman, the person who helped her and her group to get false papers and then betrayed them, the children on the train. And although so much is missing, especially, for example, the voice of her mother's killers, my suggestion is that this multi-voicedness is one of the key components of creating empathy. The multiple voices are one of the ways that the personal travels beyond the personal, potentially acquiring new meanings for new contexts, reintegrating, if temporarily, disaggregated, fragmented, partial accounts. Storytelling across difference can produce misalignments, but it also produces realignments in which we reposition ourselves. In my past work, I argued that empathy can be an alignment problem, creating a false sense of identification, a misalignment in which an emotional response becomes a substitute for understanding others. But in reviewing Rosalind's storytelling and the questions the visitors ask her, I see that these exchanges are indeed exchanges, offerings, invitations, and it's always possible that one of those visitors will take up the invitation to be accountable, to be informed, to not be disinterested. And that's all Rosalind is asking. I'm calling attention to this because I think it sheds light on how we narrate and listen to trauma narratives including the reluctance to talk about trauma and the obligation to bear witness to it and acknowledge one's place in one's own history. In my most recent conversations with her, I asked her what it was like to tell the stories, and I was surprised when she said, "It's always difficult. It's always a source of pain. It's not healing or cathartic." It's not actually empathy she seeks, but acknowledgement of suffering, and not only her suffering. In other words, it's not only a personal story. I've only scratched the surface in exploring the connections between telling, not telling, understanding, not understanding. Narrating about precarious situations, including feeling afraid, feeling humiliated, is not only about what happened, it's not only about the past, but always about multiple pasts, some of them more narratable as others, read through the lens of the present that shapes it, invokes it, challenges it, and doesn't necessarily resolve it. The past unfolds in a present that is also about who is telling and who is listening. It may be an attempt to restore humanity, and at the same time may resist what Walter Benjamin calls a redemptive narrative. Although we might tell or listen with the hope of recovery or repair, or the possibility of empowering those who reclaim their own stories, this does not depend on telling a particular kind of story, finding some kind of closure, or moving past feelings of grief. It's not only about the difficulty of communicating things that are beyond words, though words are not always possible or enough. Loss and grief can create a great desire to be heard, however inadequately. In my past work, I posed the critique of empathy, or basically the acknowledgement that our understanding is partial. And I want to reiterate that it's not the gaps in knowledge that could be repaired. I proposed that those gaps don't discredit the integrity of the telling. The gaps aren't the point. Instead, what might look like gaps are also multiple voices. The partiality and gaps in knowledge are not necessarily repaired by greater accuracy. Partialness is a part of narrating. Instead, the multiple voices, whether looking back and seeing oneself as an unprotected child or facing an unbidden memory of the past that surfaces, is part of telling and listening and retelling, and also not telling and not listening for the first time. Thank you.
Whoa. Many, many thanks for this so lucid, powerful, and highly relevant lecture, Amy. I'd just like to say, sort of in passing as well, I think I can say on behalf of everybody in the committee that our hearts go out to all of the innocent people who are caught up in the ongoing conflict in the Middle East at the moment. It just brings this to mind as well at the same time. And just watching these live interviews makes all the difference. Because you were talking about you may have to read them. Seeing them, I think, makes all the difference. Any questions from anybody? So I'm sort of lost for words for the minute, but anybody who'd like to ask questions straight away? You can just raise your hand or wave a hand, if you like here. Okay, Maggie, just unmute yourself.
I haven't a question, and I'm very sorry that I'm going to have to leave the session early, and won't be able to be here for the discussion. But I do want to just express in a most heartfelt way how moving your presentation was. Memorable. It's going to stay with me, I know, and how very instructive your comments and the multi-layered relationships that you have with your aunt and with her story and with all who come into it. And I just like to thank you so much for sharing it in your your insights with us today. Thank you so much.
Anybody else immediately? Okay, while you're thinking at least, empathy, of course, is the key word here all round. But I was wondering if, with the two different tellings of the events here, what key differences do you see? Because they're in different contexts, of course. And I'm wondering whether the story, when she tells stories of this kind within the family, for the family, whether they're different to when she's telling them within the museum, for example, for a different sort of purpose. Clearly, telling a story of any kind deeply affects her. But I'm just wondering, is there a difference?
This was really striking for me. This is what started me on the project, was that she hadn't told this story to the family. And one of us found this Shoah interview on YouTube. And when I called her and said I had watched the 3-hour interview, she was upset. She said, "How did you find it?" And she and I are extremely close. So we were able to talk about it. She was able to be honest with me about worrying that maybe she shouldn't have told it, and that people didn't really want to hear it, and that she had felt all these years that no one wanted to hear it. And so that started our conversation. So our conversation really started in the 90s when we found the interview. And then more recently, when she started telling it at the Holocaust Museum, maybe for the last 15, maybe 20 years even, she's had this wonderful interlocutor that you saw, the man who interviews her, and really makes her feel at ease. She doesn't like doing it, as I said, but then she and I have had many, many conversations about that, about telling. So, and I've recorded her telling it. I've recorded our conversations. So I've recorded conversations about what it's like for her to talk to me and what it was like to her to not talk to us. So that's what started the project for me. I think that in the intervening years, one of the things that happened was that she pieced together more information. So she found these documents with her mother's name on them, which was so shocking. But in the early interview, you can tell all of the decisions that they made because the mother was coming back. And I didn't want to play all of those for you, but it's, for me, very painful for the Martins, the people who had the laundromat, were willing to take their money so that every 3 months, the Martins paid the rent on their apartments in Paris while they were in Voiron, because they were sure that the mother would come back and would maybe come back before they did. And they wanted the mother's apartment to be there. Well, you can imagine this, right? The narration of all the decisions they made because the mother was coming back. And then much later, she discovered the mother's not coming back. And there's also narratives about after the war there was a place you could go in Paris where you could get lists of people and try to find, there was a whole agency that was trying to reconnect people. And there's stories she tells about going back, and here she's now a 13-year-old and refusing to leave until they give her information about her mother, and they're not finding any information about her mother. So this story of a life that you live with the anticipation of a reunion and the decisions you make because you're expecting that, and then much later telling a narrative in which she knows all of that, is what, that was for me what propelled me to try to figure out what was going on as a folklorist. So I am proposing here that we as folklorists know a lot about this, that the things that others say, and they're excellent things that psychiatrists have said, and so some sociologists, anthropologists, I follow everyone who writes about empathy, and they're all extremely useful. Maybe some of you know, if you care, I've written about it, so I can send you the link to the history of the term empathy. It's a 20th century term. And And it's about art objects. It's not about the kind of thing I'm talking about when the term gets invented. So I believe that as folklorists, we have a lot to contribute, really, whether it's about what I look at, which is personal narratives, or what a lot of you look at, which is folk narratives. And that I don't know that that should be your task. I'm saying that the other things that you learn, the ways you understand folk narratives, are really useful for understanding a project such as mine. And I had a long section, I had to cut it out. All of the people I'm quoting who work in folk narrative and the contributions all of you have made.
It's certainly the world that we're inhabiting at the moment, where politicians are crossing out fact and fighting about cultural memory. There's even more need, and I suppose the narratives. There's even more need to pass on narratives of this kind, maybe more than there would have been maybe 20 years. It would have been in a very different context, maybe 20 years back. But the context
I see there's a
will
question,
change,
but I want to add, add one thing which I'm now trying to puzzle through. We're hearing lots of personal stories, whether it's in the struggles in Darfur or Ukraine or in the Middle East. We're hearing personal stories, and those personal stories are often about people who've been persecuted, and they come to stand for whatever the position is that the person telling them is advocating. And there's a big gap between those personal stories and the ways in which they're used. So I'm thinking about, that's what's very much on my mind right now. And I did have one line in there in the paper in which I said that folklorists are the only ones that I'm across who don't choose sides in that argument. That is, they don't say either that we're only interested in momentous historical events or we're only interested in the everyday. We are really the only group I know that doesn't make a distinction there in terms of the relevance of our work. I mean, we make a distinction in the narratives themselves, but we find both of those dimensions very relevant. And I'm struggling with this right now, with the big picture that's applied to the stories we're hearing about people who are suffering around the world. But I think maybe Ellen had a question or a comment.
Ellen.
My name is Ellen Stickert, and I have to apologize for my voice. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Can you hear? Okay.
Yeah.
I had a surgery a couple of years ago that took out one of my vocal cords, so I'm talking to you with one vocal cord. And I have a rather unformed question, which relates to what Amy was just speaking about. With the change of technology and the way people communicate with each other, you have essentially a change between speaking person to person and speaking person to imagined persons. And I'm wondering how this new technology, the use of social links and the way people now, young people especially, communicate, how this is going to affect the kind of concept that we have of empathy. Because when you speak of empathy, you think essentially, at least I do, of an individual empathy. Yet here we're speaking now about quite a different type of empathy when you're speaking with groups or imagined groups. So my question is, do you find any difference at all in talking with somebody who has been on the social networks and tries to communicate via the personal narrative to elicit empathy, and people now who used to and stopped talking to each other as a result of this new technology?
Yeah, I'm fascinated by that as well, Ellen. And what I'm hearing, and maybe some of you are hearing similar different things, is the ways that people are both humanized and dehumanized. So that both mechanisms are happening. We're not even anywhere near empathy. We're arguing about who's human. And those discussions are familiar to me because I work in disability studies. And during COVID, for example, where resources were scarce, there were arguments that some people were less deserving, which is a way of saying they're less human than others. And I've been following this now for decades where who deserves a transplant, for example? What kind of quality of life do they have anyway? I'm saying that very cynically. For those of you who maybe aren't native English speakers, I disagree with that. And we dehumanize people through narrative as much as we humanize them. And often when we humanize one group of people, we do it to dehumanize another. So I think that social media is serving a large role in that. And it's very frightening to me. People who work on processes of reconciliation. I have a close colleague at Ohio State, Terry Murphy, who I think is one of the most brilliant, who brings people together. But she argues that truth and reconciliation has to be face to face. And so I'm paying a lot of attention to that, to some of the people who I think know a lot about how you move forward from violence, from persecution, from oppression. And we do move forward. The situations are never equal, Terry Murphy would say. You know, we can't borrow from one and say, this is how the other should work. And that's something folklorists, I think, know. And she appreciates the work of folklorists who work locally, face-to-face, ethnographically, because that's, in the end, so significant. But I think we're living in a world of social media where we need to acquire better tools for understanding, before we even get to empathy, how personal narratives humanize and dehumanize.
Just mentioning dehumanization, of course, there was a certain American politician the other day who was talking about people who are vermin who should be wiped out, and that is really worrying. Just to read Galet's comment here, and then maybe you can say something. Thank you. And this paper was a piece of the art of our discipline, deeply humane and intellectually inspiring, well-informed and smart. My words feel especially weak at the present, when all that I've struggled with my many companions for the future of Israel and Palestine is in ruins. And then I'm returning to Jerusalem after a short family visit, and the struggle continues. Galet, do you want to say something? Do you feel up to saying anything? No? Okay.
Galit, I was thinking about what's going on in the Middle East every minute when I was constructing this paper. And where I point to there not being answers is mostly there. That it's about, and also my paper was a hopeful one. I was arguing for a possibility beyond the limitations of narrative, beyond the limitations of knowledge, beyond the story ownership problems that I've written so much about for 40 years, and toward what I'm calling multiple voices. So my discussion about multiple voices, multiple forms of engagement, multiple temporal engagements with multiple voices, is the only thing I can think of right now toward some future. It's a very small contribution.
I'd be happy to say something, but there is a person before me who has raised her hand.
Oh yes, sorry.
So after her, I'll react.
Do you want to open your camera and unmute? The person who has their hands up. Okay, if you unmute and then open your camera up so we can see you too. Okay, maybe Galet, okay, here we are. Can you turn your camera on maybe too?
Okay, he's coming up.
Yeah, good. Okay, floor's yours.
I was kind of still thinking whether I should ask my question because it's very technical and the presentation was so profound and beautiful. That's why I took my time to decide whether I should ask this or not. But it's a technical question, given that I do not directly work with trauma narratives, but I work in terms of collecting belief narratives. And one thing that I wanted to, so sorry about that. One thing that I wanted to understand in terms of the notion of tellability that you talk about. I mean, what I have felt a lot of times when I go and I talk to people, I talk to them, which like I had to modify my methods quite a lot. The idea of magnificence, which they which kind of affects their tellability, as in what they should tell and what they should not tell, owing to the fact that they kind of feel like it is not magnificent enough in terms of in terms of sharing the story. To be honest, like a lot of times what happened is when I and when we got into conversation, the first question that I was asked is not even a question, it's usually a statement, like my story is not worthy, my story is not worth enough to be told. So I just want to understand how this idea of having magnificence in your narrative plays the role of tellability, in your opinion. And it's a very technical question, but I just wanted to understand, because
No, it's
to
a
be
core
honest,
it's a core question. It's an absolute core question. And I think many of us have faced in field work situations in which someone feels that their story is not worthy, or it's not their story. It might be someone else's story. So there's the magnificence question and the ownership question. And these have really driven me in my work. I've been fascinated by who do people tell a story to that isn't going to survive the moment? Because we all do that, right? So which stories survive the moment? That is a story it's worth telling right this minute, but not tomorrow, or certainly not 10 years from now. But there are also recovered stories. And one of the stories, I gave a different version of this a year ago at the American Folklore Society meeting. And at the end of it, I told a story, a very small story that I shared with my aunt. I'm not going to retell it here, but it was not a story to survive the moment. And I actually just was a little worried that I had told such a story that was meant to be just in the moment and not survive the moment. So there's that. And there are the stories that people think either they are not the right one to tell it, or it's not magnificent enough. It's not worthy of. And then the question is, worthy of what? Is it worthy of the moment? Is it a story that you might tell as a cautionary story? For example, cautionary stories are often only in the moment, right? You see someone about to do something you don't think they should do, and you pull up from somewhere some example from who knows where, and you tell them that just for that moment. So stories in the moment can be very important for the moment, but they might not be important unless it's that moment. And then we have the phrase in English, and I know we have it in Italian. I'm not sure of other languages, but you had to be there. You know, we can't tell you that story. You had to be there. That many cultures have that. And then there are people who describe getting together with old friends. And here's another one, picking up where they left off. Picking up where they left off is often really ordinary. And what does it mean to pick up where you left off, or to have ordinary life? One of the things that I think is happening right now that's very destabilizing for any of us who are worried about the world is it doesn't feel like there's much ordinary right now. The ordinary, it's hard to even grasp any value in the ordinary, because the destabilizing extraordinary is frightening. And so I had to think about that when I decided what to talk about with you, because I have other things I write about that felt too ordinary for these times. So it's not a technical question. It's a technical question, yes, because I'm interested in narrative technique and form and how tellability can be seen linguistically, sociolinguistically, and it's also a big question.
Janet, I wish I could give you a hug, by the way, in person. Yeah.
Well, I want to thank and praise Amy for a really beautiful presentation and paper, and it was very, very interesting and very moving at the same time. Like Amy, I have in all my work been invested in the many voices, in the many, the multivocal in texts and in performance. And the thing I'm asking about at this moment is how do we correlate our methodology of the many voices with the big question of truth? What is true? And I have no answer to this question. I just know that it's a big, big problem, especially today when so many voices are projected into the into our universes of discourse. We hear so many voices. Are we capable at all to deal with the question of truth? What is a true story and where are the lies? And we know what damage lies and manipulation do in the world. I think that's a question that our discipline needs somehow to take up, and we haven't done that because we've been, after so long monovocal histories of our discipline, we have been invested in looking for the many voices. And I'm thinking of and I think that Abhirop's question was very much about that, and Amy's answer to that too, because, for instance, at the moment, the reason I didn't want to talk was because I don't want to hijack this discussion to what is going on just now in the Middle East. But it is an example of where our humanity is tested in so many ways. Concepts of freedom, of integrity, of tolerance, they're all tested all the time. It's not that I feel that anybody proves any of these concepts, but there is a constant test going on, and we have to all the time relate to that test. And for instance, there's a catastrophe going on in the Sudan, and it gets much less voice in the public arena. And that's why I didn't want to once more talk about what happens in the Middle East, which is spoken all over all the time. So I met here a friend who has who does his fieldwork in the Sudan, and we were talking about the fact that there's very little about it in the discourse, and how does this happen? But the main question is the question of how do we correlate our methodology with the question of truth, and can we at all do that? So thank you for listening, and thank you for.
I purposefully mentioned Darfur. I don't know if everyone heard me say that, but that was because I'm feeling the same way. What about Darfur and Ukraine, and also many other places? But we have a family staying with us now that just crossed the Darien Gap. A man and his wife and his two tiny children, one of whom is deaf, and days in the jungle crossing the. This is a place from the link between Colombia and Panama in Central America for people trying to arrive in the United States. Anyway, I think we need to, as folklorists, use our skills to de-amplify. We know how to de-amplify. We're watching things get amplified. A personal story gets amplified, and we have some skills to de-amplify. It's not going to be sufficient, but we start with who told that story, to whom? Did the person understand the language of were these interlocutors speaking the same literal language? I don't mean figurative language. I mean, do they share a linguistic language to speak in, or are there translators? Who are the amplifiers? How are the journalists running the truth today. And we're so grateful to them because other people aren't speaking at all. So, and many of them have a voice, and I'm very grateful to them for using it. But the NGOs, everyone is speaking and amplifying a personal story to be larger than personal. And it's understandable. Every one of these stories is larger than personal, as my aunt's story was. And as she sees it that way, she doesn't talk about it to tell her story. She wants to tell a story of the Holocaust, not the story of Rosalind. But amplification is a dangerous thing because it's amplified for particular purposes always. And it's not necessarily the truth. We don't get to the truth through amplification. Would be one place to start as folklorists. That we know in folk tales that folk tales are used in contexts, in performances, for very different ends. Folk tales are always amplified, right? They're always drawn from a tradition and told in a context as larger than life stories that are supposed to have meaning for a particular context or large context that are amplified. But that amplification, which is what social media is doing, back to Ellen's question, is dangerous. And it's really keeping us from seeing the truth. So I don't know what to do about it. Maybe some of you have answers, but I am very worried about the personal story being a stand-in for the truth. It starts with, this happened to me. Let me tell you, this happened to me. I was there. I saw this with my own two eyes. This is what I saw, and I am a witness. Believe me. That is not sufficient. And when it gets amplified and taken out of its context, and that personal story, as tragic as it is, as close to our hearts as it is, as heartbroken as I am, hearing all of them, is a problem when it is used for some other purpose, for some other agenda. And that's what's happening here, is that personal stories are being used as rationales for action. And there's a gap there that we have to recognize. Wait a minute, I get the personal story, I get the tragedy, but that rationale, wait a minute here, is all I want to say. Because that truth of the rationale isn't the same as that truth of that personal story. I don't know if that's helpful. That's in part, I think, what Terry Murphy does with her truth and reconciliation things. But to give you a negative version, so she brought together, when the big dispute was going on in Syria, she brought together all of these different factions, brought them all to Northern Ireland. I still don't know why, but she did. So she brought all of these different factions from Syria to Northern Ireland to talk with each other. And they're all present in the room, and they went around and talked about what the problems they were facing right then. Lots of personal stories, lots of grief, lots of trauma. And then she said, I want you each write down on a piece of paper what you would do as soon as this is over. What's the next thing? And they had 100% agreement. Revenge. And that's where her work had to start. So talking about your stories, telling your stories, and the goal that everyone agreed on is revenge against each other. That's where she does believe in what she does, and that truth and reconciliation is possible. It's a mode of moving forward, by the way. You don't reconcile, actually, anything. So there isn't any agreement on the truth of the past. She's worked in South Africa and in Rwanda, Yugoslavia, and it's about a shared vision for the future, which she thinks is already there. She thinks that they already have it if they can move toward it. That's a positive note too. I think in the Middle East also, that may be the case. In Darfur, I've heard that it is the case, that people know what the future should look like. But narratively, the problem is that we are amplifying the personal. as if it's a rationale for action.
And certainly we need to remember always that stories have consequences.
Yeah, we're out of time, I guess.
No, you're exactly. All stories have consequences, whether they're true or false. Any further questions before we wrap up here? Amy, where are you? Oh, yeah. So you said your picture suddenly moved. Yeah, Suzanne.
There's one question, Suzanne.
Thank you so much, and I'm also quite overwhelmed still, and thank you both for the talk and this very insightful also discussion. And I just had a question about the multiplicity of voices, and did I understand it correctly that you see it as a prerequisite for this sort of bridging of the individual and the collective and the understanding? And I was also wondering if it sort of, in what ways it works. I was thinking, you mentioned the hashtag #MeToo. Is that the kind of inverted multiplicity that you actually, it's just boiled down to? So it sort of works both ways,
Yes.
that one story can have multiple voices, but the other way around too.
Right, that's exactly right. I think that the only skills I have are as a narrative scholar, folklorist, and I can see how multiple voices get used in narratives. I'm not saying that the multiplicity itself solves something. I'm saying that we can see how the narrative has them, that narratives have these multiple voices, and that rather than looking only at narratives have gaps in knowledge, or that we can't, that we have limits on what we can tell, that in addition to that, those things are true, that we also can see that we offer these multiple different voices, and that those voices are a way in for people to hear. Because I'm interested in primarily in hearing. I'm interested in, as I said more than once, listening, not listening. I included in my list of people, the people who aren't listening. And I think that when people do listen, even if there are gaps, even if we're culturally so divided, even if the people in the Holocaust Museum ask rather insensitive questions, I think that we can see an alignment with one of the voices, so that the fact that there are multiple voices offers that possibility for multiple alignments, and those alignments are what we seek. In addition, I've written so much about disalignment and misalignment, and in today's world, I wanted to find some place to see alignment, to see that we do, not as identity, because that's way too big. I'm not saying we identify with others, just saying there's an alignment with the voice.
Okay, anybody else? This has been such a powerful lecture, Amy, and I'm really glad that we have this recorded, because it's going to be so important, I think, for our students to be able to hear it as well. I know many places exams and things are going on and whatever else, but the great thing is that it's available, and as a beginning for discussion, and it's so relevant. Many thanks. From Miriam, by the way, as you just see here, Miriam apologizes that she had to leave for another Zoom meeting. But she would like to have been here at the end. But many thanks for this lecture. Great to see the rest of you here. Galet, I'm with you. And look after yourselves. Many thanks for coming along. And hopefully we'll see you at the next lecture that comes up soon. Many thanks again.
Thank you.